creativity and everything we know about it from science. Now you might be wondering what I'm doing on a forest trail for this kind of video, and well, other than the fact that I like hiking, I think it's a pretty good indicator that I actually read through the things that I'm going to be talking about and put enough effort into it that I can talk about it like this with the help of just some bullet points that I put down on my Kindle here, which I feel like is becoming, I don't know, maybe an increasingly less popular thing to do on YouTube these days, where there's this faceless epidemic of generating AI ideas and then generating a script from those ideas, then pumping that through some AI voiceover tool, then generating AI images or videos, stitching it together, all for the purpose of just pumping out as many videos as humanly possible and getting monetized. I don't know, and I have a problem with that. Because when I watch videos, I feel like, and I know this is a bit of a rant, we'll get to the actual creativity in a second, but I thought I should explain this. And I have a problem with it because whenever I watch a video, I feel like I could have chosen any video to watch, and so I'm giving you my time and attention, and in a sense I feel like I don't know, like you have to demonstrate that you put enough effort into the video to justify the time and attention that I'm giving you. It's almost like I'm expecting a fair trade of resources. This is obviously never the case with AI videos, because the effort put into them is, well, I don't want to say zero, but it's pretty close to it. But more importantly, you don't get a whole lot of return on your investment, in the sense that if you have a 10-minute AI video, you could, because it's generated by AI, you could find out all that information by yourself in 10 minutes or less, because you could just go and ask AI yourself. Whereas with this kind of video that I'm trying to do here, I'm hoping that the return on your time and attention will be much greater than that. I spend a week, give or take, on putting this together, like finding the research and reading through it and synthesizing the information and putting it into some digestible format. And so even if this video was, I don't know, like 3 hours long or something, I could still confidently claim that you wouldn't be able to put together this information in 3 hours or less, unless you, I don't know, have some special method that I don't know about, in which case please let me know. So on to the actual creativity stuff. Sorry, that was a long rant. So there's some context that we need to set in place that will be relevant to everything that follows. So the first thing is that I will probably mention the phrase statistical significance, or something being statistically significant, many times. And that's the kind of topic you could write an entire book about. Some people definitely have already. I mean, I couldn't, but you get the point. Now, regardless of whether you are familiar with the term or not, I think the definition, or sort of the understanding of it, that we can get away with for the purpose of this video is to say that when something is found to be statistically significant, all it's saying is that if there was no effect here in the things you're studying, it would be quite rare to see the data that you're seeing, or even more extreme data. How rare? Well, the usual threshold is a p-value of 0.05 or 5%, or 1 in 20. And 1 in 20, that's pretty rare, but it's not that rare. But that's for another time. But crucially, it doesn't prove anything per se. It doesn't prove your hypothesis. All it's saying is that, okay, the data you're seeing, pretty unlikely if there's no effect, but it doesn't tell you what that effect is. And of course, if you do like really thorough studies and all kinds of statistical analysis, and then you can derive some causation here, but generally speaking, it's not proof, it's not the holy grail, but it's a good standard. Certainly better than claiming something to be true that is not found to be statistically significant. And speaking of, and I will not bore you to death with this, but just keep in mind that a lot of these studies find correlations between data, not causations. Oftentimes they call it an association between, some variable like creativity and something else. But association in this context is a synonym for correlation, not causation. So that's that part done. Creativity is a topic that has been the subject of a lot of research over the past many decades. And on the one hand, that's good. On the other hand, you can probably agree that it's not a very easy thing to define. And everyone will probably define it differently. And so that creates a slight, I don't want to call it a problem, but studies that found some association between creativity and something else from many decades ago may not be as relevant as some recent studies, because over the course of that time, our understanding and definition of creativity has shifted quite a bit. So it's not that those older research papers are useless in any way. Of course they're not, but we also have to be mindful of how that definition has evolved over time. And so how has it evolved? Maybe we can start with the kind of definition that most everyone would agree with, which is that creativity is the process of producing ideas that are novel and useful. Mostly everyone agrees with that, but to be more specific, divergent thinking is kind of the core component that creativity has been associated with for basically ever since it started getting some research, where divergent thinking would be going from, well, to put it in an abstract way, going from few to many, or from nothing to many. So generating ideas. A quintessential example here would probably be some some brainstorming session. And convergent thinking would be, well, the opposite of that, right? Going from many to few. So taking the 30 ideas you came up with and trimming that down to 3, 2, or maybe even one best idea. And for a long time, convergent thinking was thought to be basically on the other side of the spectrum of creativity, because while it makes intuitive sense to associate divergent thinking with creativity, convergent thinking intuitively makes more sense to associate it with something sort of analytical or evaluative. You're not creating in a sense, you're almost like destroying, if that makes sense. But recently there's been more research papers that incorporate the aspect of convergent thinking into the definition of creativity as well. That's kind of interesting, because children are not only thought to, but have also, I think, been demonstrated to be more creative than adults. Now, of course, it depends on what domain you're measuring, but like these were standard tests to measure creativity, which we'll get to in a second. But so children are shown to be more creative than adults, but we also know that children perform worse on divergent thinking than adults, right? And so that doesn't quite square with the idea that creativity is synonymous only with divergent thinking. There must be something more happening here. So that's roughly the definitions. And lastly, before we go on to the first study, is that there's many ways you can measure creativity, and none of them are really the kinds of tests that would convince you, or like, you know, any person that is not a scientist, that okay, yeah, that's how I imagine creativity to be tested. Of course, there's qualitative and quantitative ways to measure that. As for the qualitative ways, often they have researchers bring in experts to rate the ideas or products of participants. And for the quantitative assessment of creativity, there's a handful of kind of these, I think we can call them industry standard tests, where I think the most common one is where you are given some everyday object, like a ping pong ball or a fork or something, and your task is to come up with as many use cases for that object as possible within some allotted time frame, and then you're scored on the number of ideas, their originality, as well as their fluency. And then the other common test is that you're given some 3 words, and your task is to find a 4th word that connects the other 3 somehow. And sometimes that literally just means that if you were to use that 4th word as a prefix or a suffix to the other 3, then that would make sense. Sometimes it means finding a 4th word that connects the other 3 in some metaphorical sense, but as the gist of it, and we'll have a specific example later on. So that's the context. Statistical significance with various definitions of creativity, and the fact that the industry standard tests to measure creativity are quite basic. I don't mean that in a bad way, but it is what it is. So, first study. Oh, my Kindle turned off, but I think I will be able to remember it. These things take so long to turn on. So the first study is titled Inspired by Mary Jane, Mechanisms Underlying Enhanced Creativity in Cannabis Users. As you can probably tell, this is a cannabis study from 2017. It had 721 participants. Both groups were tested sober, and by both groups I mean one group were cannabis users and the other group were non-cannabis users. The test they did was a questionnaire on self-reported creativity. They also did objective creativity tests on divergent and convergent thinking, and they also completed the Big 5 personality trait test that measures basically what percentile you are compared to the population on, let's see if I can remember, on extraversion, openness to experience, neuroticism, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. Yeah, I think that would be right. Unless I said agreeableness as the first thing, in which case the last one I meant to say was extraversion. Anyway, that's the Big 5. What they found is what the cannabis users self-reported higher levels of creativity, which is not all that interesting, of course. But what is interesting is that the cannabis users also did actually score higher on divergent. No, they scored better on the convergent thinking task, and they also scored higher on openness to experience and extraversion on the Big 5 personality test. But perhaps the most interesting part here is that when the researchers controlled for the differences in personality, or for the fact that they were more open to experience and more extroverted, then that increase in their performance on the creativity task basically vanished. What does that mean? Well, that means that the cannabis users are the kind of people who are both more likely to use cannabis and more likely to score better on tasks of convergent thinking. It's not that one caused the other. Is that's just the kind of personality traits that they were given. Well, not given, but I guess born with. And that has downstream effects on precisely these kinds of things. So that's the first study done. The second one is titled More Creative Through Positive Mood. Not everyone. And this one had 81 Dutch university students, and they measured their mood through questionnaires, their dopamine levels through eye blink rate, which, believe it or not, is a thing, as well as their performance on creativity tasks. Basically the conclusion of this study is that there's sort of this U-curve relationship here between dopamine, so baseline, or what they call tonic dopamine levels, and creativity. Meaning, if the dopamine is too low, then you're not going to perform that great. If it's really high, you're also not going to perform that great. But if it's sort of in moderate levels, that's when that's what a sweet spot is. And at this point you may wonder, okay, but where does mood come into play here? Well, it comes into play because we know from various other studies that mood is quite tightly coupled with dopamine, and so, among other things, if your mood improves, and sometimes through some specific ways, that can increase your dopamine, and vice versa. And so they tried to assess the relationship between their mood and dopamine levels, and as well as induce positive or negative moods to see whether that shift in the mood and therefore the dopamine levels also causes an observable and statistically significant change in their performance on creativity tasks. The other interesting part about this study is that the effect was not statistically significant for people with an already high baseline dopamine level. And what they point to at the end of the study is, and that's also why it was titled this way. So again, the title is More Creative Through Positive Mood, Not Everyone. And they say this because they saw that even if someone has a high baseline level of dopamine and therefore presumably is in a good mood, their creativity performance is actually not as good compared to someone with a moderate baseline. And the other thing that supports this is that inducing negative mood in the participants did not reliably affect creativity. So to me, the conclusion from this study is that happy does not equal creative. Next one. Improving creativity performance by short-term meditation. That's the title. The study had 40 Chinese undergrads and split them in two groups. One group was doing what is called integrative, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. So integrative. I guess you know what I'm trying to say. Integrative, let's stick with that. Mind-body meditation training. And the other was doing progressive muscle relaxation. So this integrative, my goodness, that word is giving me a tough time. Mind-body training. So this is not just kind of like sitting and chilling or relaxing. It is quite an active meditation protocol that is also guided, and as you can probably tell from the name of it, focuses on trying to get you in a state where you pay close attention to the physical sensations of your body. Now, crucially, They did this for 30 minutes a day, 7 days a week, which I found interesting because I think if you were to ask people in the general population, I mean, from those who meditate, how long their sessions are on average, it will probably be 10 minutes. And I think there's a lot of, I don't know if they're guides, but a lot of videos on YouTube about the alleged benefits of meditation, which, like, there are plenty of that are supported by science, but it seems that many people think it is sufficient to do it, I don't know, for like a minute or 5 minutes a day and expect some magic to happen in a short period of time. Whereas, like I said, in this study, it was 30 minutes a day. It's quite a lot. Now, they did it only for 7 days, so it is possible that, I mean, I'm just hypothesizing myself here, but I think it would be possible that if you did it for 10 minutes a day, but maybe instead of 1 week, you do it for 3 weeks, maybe that would have the same benefit. I don't really know if it's the length of the session that matters most here, or kind of just like the total session time. Oh, that's a deer. I don't know if you saw it. There's so many of them here at night. Most frightening thing, because their eyes glow when you look at them with a headlamp. Anyway, so back to this study. The things that were tested were divergent aspects of thinking, like fluency, flexibility, or originality. We kind of mentioned that earlier, where fluency measures how many ideas you generate, flexibility is the diversity of said ideas, and originality is, that's originality, novelty of ideas. This group that did the mind-body meditation training significantly improved on the test of divergent thinking compared to the control group. The suggested mechanism here, they said it's probably because of improved mood regulation / emotional regulation. What I find interesting here, and this aligns quite nicely with the finding of the previous study as well, which is they're both groups. Let me say that again. The mood of both groups improved, but the performance on creativity tests improved in only one of the groups, which means that just like in a previous study, this one is suggesting that it's not the mood that is responsible for that increased performance, but some other mechanism. And like I said, they speculate that in this case is the improved emotional regulation that the meditation practice develops. Next study, titled "Can Extreme Experiences Enhance Creativity? The Case of the Underwater Nightclub." And this is not a joke, and the title is not an exaggeration. So this study had 68 self-selected participants, 29 males, 39 females, average age 26. And the participants went through what the study describes as, and I'm quoting here, a 2-day multi-sensory experience involving a dance floor, advanced sound systems, and laser light shows at Deep House, an underwater pool party organized by Desperados, a brand of beer flavored with tequila and sold by Heineken. I don't know why they had to put, end quote, I don't know why they had to put so many brand names in there, but exactly like it sounds, just a literal underwater nightclub. They don't say it in this paragraph, but they also had pool divers dressed as mermaids. and the participants were tested both before and after this experience. And what they observed is that compared to testing before, that the results on the test that they took after the experience showed a moderately strong boost on divergent thinking, but didn't significantly affect convergent thinking. So specifically, they the participants on the test came up with 28% more ideas on one test, and their drawings were also rated 31% more creative compared to those controls. The mood improved post-experience, but again, this is the third time in a row, it did not statistically account for, sorry, I'm burping a bit, it did not statistically account for the creativity boost. And so what they're suggesting is that it was the experience itself that seemed to be the kind of the main ingredient here, where the likely cause of that improved performance is just simply novelty and the intensity of some particular experience. Next study, titled Targeted Dream Incubation at Sleep Onset Increases Post-Sleep Creative Performance. 50 participants, roughly 50-50 male and female split, average age 27. This was basically a daytime napping study. So they, discard this part. Let's see how we can tackle this. So when you go to sleep, as you probably know, you go through various stages of sleep, like REM, non-REM, deep, light. But the very first stage is what they call the N1 stage. Okay, it's not like they call it N1, I think. It's a pretty standard way to call it, but it's also called hypnagogia. And that's the stage of sleep where it's like you're neither fully awake nor fully asleep. It's sort of in this liminal space in between. And the method they had here, so the participants wore what was called a Dormio device. It was made of two parts. One was like a face mask, or like a sleep mask, and they also wore a device on, I think it was their wrist, that measured, like various physiological signs. And so they had this 45-minute long session during which they would basically try to fall asleep and spend some time in that N1 stage. And the reason for wearing those devices is that they had a bunch of mechanisms in place, or I guess algorithms, that would detect certain physiological changes, like let's say a decrease of heart rate by 5 beats per minute, in addition to some other ones. And if that happened, it meant that the people were transitioning into basically full sleep, which is what they try to prevent. And so at that moment, the sleep mask, which had a built-in speaker, would just play this prompt that would softly wake up the participants. I should also mention that in this study, they were split into 4 groups based on two variables. So the first variable was, are we gonna have these people do that almost like a sleeping session or not? And so one group did, and the other was just fully awake. But the other very important variable here is what they called incubation, which was prompting the participants with a certain topic to think about, on which they would also be tested afterwards. In this case, it was trees, for whatever reason. And so I had 4 groups. So the first group was people who did the sleeping session and were prompted to think about trees. People who were awake and were prompted to think about trees. People who went for a sleeping session but were not prompted to think about trees. And lastly, people who were neither prompted to think about trees nor went to sleep. And they completed 3 creativity tests right after the session ended. What they found was a statistically significant positive impact only for the sleep and only for the group that went to sleep and was also prompted to think about trees. And that's basically the main conclusion here. Now, what I do find interesting is that, and I'm not sure where I first heard this, and I hope it is not just some pseudoscience that sounds cool, but it sounds very plausible given the findings here. But that when you had these really influential scientists from the 20th century, they would, like physicists for example, that they would hold some object in their hand and maybe lay down on almost like a chair where you would be neither like laying down nor sleeping. And so they would hold the object in their hand and basically try to fall asleep. But if they did fall asleep, well, their muscles would automatically relax, causing them to drop the object, and that would wake them up. And so they would do that maybe several times. And so in a way, they kind of mimicked what this study was doing to make themselves spend more time in that N1 sleep phase. I find that kind of interesting. And at the end of this video, I'll do a recap of all the findings, but the finding of, I guess the conclusion or the takeaway from this study is that it is helpful to, well, assuming you want to increase creativity, that it is helpful to think about the topic or the problem that you want to improve creativity on before you go to sleep. I just realized I forgot a crucial part here. It wasn't necessarily the fact that they went to sleep and were prompted to think about trees. It was also the fact that this worked only for people for whom the theme of trees appeared in those dreams, if we can call them dreams. So that's why they were prompted to think about it. And so it is, I think, reasonable to assume that if you merely think about a topic before going to sleep, it's not going to magically improve your creativity the next day on that topic. But if it also appears in your dreams, then it has a much higher chance of doing so. Next study, titled "When Putting Work Off Pays Off: The Curvilinear Relationship Between Procrastination and Creativity." So this one had 119 undergrad US students split into 3 different groups of various procrastination levels, meaning each group would be given different is differently attractive incentives to procrastinate. You'll see what I mean in a second. The method was actually pretty clever. I'm gonna have to read this because it is quite detailed. So the researchers told the students to write a business proposal for a student entrepreneur who had just won 10,000 to $10,000 to start his own company. They gave them the bio of Mike Goodman, the brother of a senior product designer for SNL, also mentioning that it was Mike that came up with the Mean Tweets SNL segment that is now very popular. I'm sure everyone knows this. And below the biography of Mike Goodman, the researchers also included some of Mike's favorite segments from that Mean Tweets series. And so this was the procrastination incentive at play, watching those videos instead of actually doing the task that they were assigned. And the low procrastination group had only one video they could watch. Moderate had 4, and the high had 8. The finding was that the moderate procrastination group performed better than the low or high procrastination group. They suggest that this is causal. They did a bunch of pre-tests to eliminate some other potentially confounding variables, and also employed a bunch of other statistical methods to rule out some spurious correlations. And the procrastination in this context more specifically just means a delay in starting, progressing, or finishing the task. What they suggest is that it's basically about having some incubation period, some time away from the task that allows you to combine ideas in novel ways. We'll actually get to something similar in a second that I think explains it slightly better, but that's what they claim. This works, at least in this study, it worked specifically for. I'm not entirely sure where I am, but that's fine. In this study, it worked specifically for enhancing novelty and usefulness of ideas, but it of course hurt the task efficiency and quantity of output. What they also point out is that this really worked best in cases where the person already had high intrinsic motivation to begin with. And lastly, just to note, the creativity here was rated by external people, not like random people, but people who knew what they were doing in this context. Next study, titled Creative Diversity, Patterns in the Creative Habits of 10,000 People. As you can probably guess, it was a survey of 10,000 people, so not necessarily a study, but nevertheless quite interesting. And they try to map creative habits. Okay, a lot of it is a bit goofy because they use terms like creative species, or some of these creative species that they came up with, they gave them names like Mono Routinus or YOLO Chaotis, which I don't know, man. I don't feel like that. I don't feel like that typically helps with the perceived credibility on the part of the reader, but yeah, I just found it funny. The main takeaway here is that there was no single habit or cluster of habits that was universally dominant. I mean, they did cluster or categorize people's habits into like 7 different groups, some different creative species, if I remember correctly, but none of them was really dominant. And so to them, this undermined the idea that there's some one single optimal creative style. And so if you see I guess the takeaway here is that if you see some video of, you know, the creative habits of, you know, this person or that person who is genuinely maybe very creative or I don't know, famous or whatever it is, we can't say it doesn't work for them, obviously, but there is no guarantee that it's going to work for you. Which may sound obvious, but like, if you were to, I don't know, watch the workout routine of, I don't know, Ronnie Coleman or someone like that, and then you were to copy that workout routine, you would still probably get pretty decent results with that. So it's much more transferable, right? Whereas the creative habits simply are not in the same category of transferability. The last note on this study, this was a survey of basically random people, and yeah, this was all like self-reported stuff in the questionnaire on like what helps them and just their habits, and that's it for the study. Next one, I don't have a specific title here because this is just a quick summary of what were 3 different studies, Nobel laureates. And the main takeaway in all of these studies is that the Nobel laureates that they looked at, they all, sorry, not all, but a very, very large percentage of them have like extremely diverse interests and skill sets across very different domains. But they also point out like this is not just casual dabbling, but almost like a very serious amateur, even in a secondary domain. They actually take it seriously and put in the time. So it's not merely just some intellectual interest, but they heavily engage with it. So the conclusion is, I don't know, if you are a developer, maybe try to spend your weekends learning, I don't know, 3D software, or vice versa, or do something like entirely different. Maybe, I don't know, learn how to make music, or just like pick an entirely different domain and try to get semi-serious about it. That may help. Next study, titled The Influence of Natural Environments on Creativity. This one had 100 participants, all over the age of 20. Average age was 23. Here they had people look at images of natural environments, like specifically those within an urban context, like a university campus, for whatever reason. So these are like parks or tree-lined paths. Oops, almost slipped. Like water stuff. And they had them view these images for about 3 minutes before and during a creative task. Pretty sure I should go right here, but I'll probably come back here later. So the outcome is that it was a significantly better performance for expanding on their ideas and generating ideas across different categories, but the results were not significant for the number of ideas or their originality. The mechanism they suggested here was so what they call like attention restoration, that looking at images of nature or something of that sort restored attention because they were scored higher on measures like giving you a sense of scope, or like being away, or I don't know exactly how to explain it, but I think you know what I mean. If you ever been to, I don't know, to a forest or seen some natural environments, I feel like subjectively, maybe even intuitively, it does it does kind of feel like that, but to me the interesting part about this study is that, remember, they didn't spend time in nature here. They looked at an image of images that were rated as natural in urban environments for 3 minutes, and that apparently had a statistically significant increase on certain aspects of their creativity. It's pretty potent. Next study, titled "The Impact of Nature on Creativity," a study among Danish creative professionals. So this is another study on creativity and its sort of relationship with nature. This was not, I mean, it was a study, but it was basically a questionnaire of some Danish creative professionals. It's almost like interviews, but it was self-reported. And the outcome was that environments that were again rated high in a sort of in their degree to which they are natural seemed most beneficial to these people. To them it seemed especially helpful for the preparation phase, so like sparking curiosity, gathering initial thoughts, and letting ideas, quote, simmer. And again, even in this study, that same theory of attention restoration comes up, meaning that nature supposedly restores depleted directed attention by engaging in what they called, quote, soft fascination, which is pretty effortless, and that can help combat mental fatigue. So this was like I mentioned, a qualitative study. Next one. Physical order produces healthy choices, generosity, and conventionality, whereas disorder produces creativity. This study had 48 American students put either in an orderly or disorderly room and instructed them to complete a creative task. The outcome was that the participants who completed the task in the disorderly room generated significantly more creative ideas on the alternate uses task. So that's an example of the task that I mentioned earlier at the very start of this video, where you're basically given some object, some short time frame, and your goal is to come up with as many ideas as you can for that object. Many use cases, sorry. The mechanism for why this works, my goodness, these birds are loud. The mechanism for why this works is that they suggest it possibly encourages breaking free from tradition and convention. In case you didn't hear that it encourages breaking free from tradition/convention. The caveat that I noted here is that it resulted in more creative ideas as measured by the test, not the number of ideas. Next study, titled "Uncorking the Muse, Alcohol Intoxication Facilitates Creative Problem Solving." So this study had 40 male social drinkers aged 21 to 30, hired from Craigslist and in the university community, and 20 of them were in the control group. They did what is called the remote associates test. Again, one of the things I mentioned earlier, which is where you're presented with 3 words and the task is to find the 4th that connects them, and I promise there will be an example, so here it is. So the input might be, like, you're given the words aid, so that's the first. Second is rubber. The third is wagon. And so what's the answer here? What's the fourth word that connects them? The answer is band. Why? Well, because you can do band-aid, rubber band, and bandwagon. This sounds kind of trivial and simple, but trust me, I've looked at some of the variations of this that are rated as very difficult. You can find them online if you search for the remote associates test, and they are not very intuitive. The result of this study was that people who were moderately drunk, which are defined as having a blood alcohol content of 0.075, that this group solved more problems correctly, faster, and the solutions to them felt more like sudden insights rather than just kind of like a step-by-step solution. It was not hugely significant, but notable. The suggested mechanism was that the alcohol, because we know it dials down executive function, which is usually not very good, but that for these kinds of tests, it may help people from kind of fixating on obvious yet wrong answers. The important caveat here is that, like I mentioned at the beginning, this was tested only for the population of male social drinkers aged 21 to 30. It's entirely possible that if you take a slightly different demographic, it may not work at all. I don't know. It may work better. I also don't know, but yeah, and also moderately drunk. So, and maybe most importantly, the effect was very, very moderate. So my takeaway from this is that consuming alcohol is probably not the best way you can increase creativity, but a mild consumption of it, if you're in that demographic, it's probably not going to hurt your creativity. The next study is titled the Diversifying Experience Model, taking a broader conceptual view of the multiculturalism creativity link. So this was a theoretical model based on reviewing some other studies. The suggestion was to seek what they call diversifying experiences, meaning engaging with stuff outside of our bubble, so like different cultures, unexpected diversity, like violating expectations. This doesn't mean, I don't know, taking a shit in the street, because that certainly violates some expectations of the people around you, but it's probably not going to help your creativity. Yeah, but the entire idea is, it's quite consistent with the underwater nightclub study. Less routine, more novelty. The key here was moderate exposure, and they said that this only works if you have what they called adaptive personal resources. Basically, if you can cope effectively with having less routine and more novelty. So what are some examples of those adaptive personal resources? Things like intelligence, self-sufficiency, money can be another, low neuroticism, social support, etc. And if you have those resources, then a moderately diversifying experience is not viewed as debilitating, but as a challenge, like a good challenge. If you don't have those resources, then it just becomes overwhelming and almost like a threat, and does not really confer benefits. Next study is titled The Impact of Physical Exercise on Convergent and Divergent Thinking. They had the participants do moderate or intense physical exercise. In this case, it was cycling. The sample were non-athletes, which they defined as people who did less than one exercise session per week, and the other group were athletes, which they defined as people who did at least 3 exercise sessions per week for at least 2 years. They tested the participants on convergent and divergent thinking. The sample size was around 100, roughly evenly split. On test of divergent thinking, I found this kind of surprising. The performance went down for both groups, and on tasks of convergent thinking, the performance was significantly worse for non-athletes, but for athletes, it showed a benefit approaching significance. Not quite statistically significant, but approaching. And the creative task was administered both during and after the exercise. So presumably this was not like, a salt bike type of exercise, because it's kind of hard to imagine doing some creative task on it, but that's what they did. So that's what I try to say with the last sentence, is that they were not doing assault bike cycling, but that indeed the creativity tests were administered both during and after the exercise session. Next study is titled, my Kindle just went from having a battery charge of 35 to 37%. Interesting. Next study is titled Freedom from Constraints. Darkness and dim illumination promote creativity. So this study looked at illumination, how bright a room is. And they tested 150 lux and 25 lux. So for comparison, this is going to be a hard comparison to make, but like LED table lamps can go anywhere from 300 to 1000 lux. So when we say that this study looked at dim lighting, like we really mean dim lighting. The outcome was a significant boost on tasks like finding alternate uses for objects or having an insight in some problem-solving task. The proposed mechanism was that dim lighting may foster a better sense of being free from constraints. It's almost like incentivizing you to take higher risk or having a more explorative processing style. It's almost like it gives you I suppose subconsciously, a sense of almost like being hidden, right? Because the room is so dark. The caveat here is that the benefit was observed only for the creative generation, so like brainstorming or insights, but it wasn't present for creative evaluation, like analyzing or judging ideas. One last note of interest is the light's setting or position. So in this study, these dim lights were, and they make sure to kind of point this out in the study, which is that the dim lights were quite literally in front of the subjects. So this was not ambient illumination, but a very, very dim light placed I'm thinking if I should say this in meters or feet, or 1 meter in front of them. So 3 feet, I don't know how long that is, but sort of like that. Imagine looking at a computer monitor and having a light behind it that you also see. So the light wasn't hidden. What am I saying? The light wasn't hidden. It was behind and above the monitor. So that's for this study. Next one is titled Exploring the Effect of Microdosing Psychedelics on Creativity in an Open Label Natural Setting. As you can guess, this was a Dutch study where this stuff is legal. The study had 38 participants at a Dutch microdosing event. methods. They ingested 0.37 grams of dried truffles that were confirmed to contain psilocybin. The creativity of these participants was tested before ingesting it and 1.5 hours after ingesting it. The result was a statistically significant improvement on both convergent and divergent thinking tasks, but the effect was moderate. The major caveat here, of course, is the fact that you can't really have placebo controls in this study, meaning if you are given psilocybin, if you eat some mushrooms, you're gonna know. There's no chance you're not gonna know. Maybe it depends on how much you take. I mean, if it's really microdosing, I do imagine that some people would probably think that they're sober, even if they're not, and vice versa. But yeah, with these kinds of studies, it's always difficult to have placebos, which doesn't mean they should be discarded or that they're somehow invalid, but that the results should be interpreted with slightly more caution. Let's look at what we have next. Study titled Creativity Enhancement Methods for Adults, a meta-analysis. This was a huge meta-analysis, an extremely long paper that looked at, my God, I don't even know how many papers, like 150 maybe, if I'm remembering correctly. What they found, and I'm listing this in order of not importance, but how beneficial the meta-analysis found it to be for enhancing creativity. So the first, and I found this like one of the most surprising things during this whole research, the one thing they found to be most beneficial for creativity were complex training courses, followed by meditation, followed by cultural exposure. And what they didn't find to be particularly helpful were drugs like cognitive enhancers, creativity awareness trainings, like priming people, be creative or whatever, and physical activity. We'll get to that in a second. Physical activity is a bit, I don't want to call it controversial, but the results are quite mixed. But their meta-analysis didn't find it to be particularly effective. And the last one that they didn't find to be all that effective was direct brain stimulation. So there was a huge variability across almost all of these analyses. The results varied widely, like even for what were found to be effective methods. So an example of that is, just like I mentioned, the physical exercise, which we'll get to again in a second. So some studies find it to be like very, very convincingly effective. Other ones say doesn't really help. So a lot of variability. As for the courses, you maybe heard me say complex training courses, and you wondered, what is that supposed to mean? I did too. In this context, what it meant was like these long haul and multi-week or like like a semester long cognitive quote boot camps on diverse creativity topics, as well as like systematic skill practice. So this might have been like design thinking frameworks, like problem solving, metacognition, basically learning how the mind works and various methods to think and produce ideas. Meaning, like reading a Twitter thread of some alleged creativity tips and tricks or whatever, that may not necessarily be that helpful. It may, I'm not discarding that entirely, but I just wanted to point out that when I say complex training courses, like these were like pretty long and intensive, and presumably led by people who really knew what they were talking about. So if you wanted to do that yourself, I think your best bet would be just like finding, and I'm sure you're gonna find a lot of stuff like this for free on YouTube under the title, like, you know, metacognition, Harvard lecture or something like that. A lot of universities post lectures, especially on these kind of topics, so maybe that can be helpful. I think anyway is the closest you can probably get to what they meant in this study by complex training courses. Alright, so the next study is titled Everyday Bodily Movement is Associated with Creativity Independently from Active Positive Affect, a Bayesian Mediation Analysis Approach. So that was a mouthful, but it wasn't as complicated as it may sound. Let's break it down. The study had 79 participants, of which 42 were women, age range 18 to 33. All of these were university students. They tested them on verbal creativity, so like producing as many original and creative uses of conventional everyday objects within 1 minute. And they also had them tested on what's called figural creativity. So like they give you a bunch of different lines, and your task is to extend these abstract lines or connect them in a way that results in some novel output to connect them in an original and creative way. Now, importantly, they tracked people's physical movement with accelerometers. And they point out this part as something important, because a lot of studies prior to this that looked at the relationship between exercise and creativity, the way they measured physical exercise was by basically giving people questionnaires, like self-reported activity levels. Not always, but quite commonly. And so they wanted to make this a lot more objective, and that's why they had people wear accelerometers, which is, I guess you can imagine like wearing just a device that measures whenever you move. What they found was that higher levels of everyday bodily movement were associated with higher creativity. Now, if you are wondering what does higher levels of everyday bodily movement mean, like this wasn't some exercise protocol. This didn't mean like some acute exercise or biking session. It just means like if you move more during the day, you know, like maybe if someone opts out to walk somewhere instead of driving in a similar cases, and that would be an example of everyday bodily movement, you know, literally just walking. What they also found is that these higher levels of everyday movement correlated with high positive activated affect, which is that phrase that was in the title. What this means is just like someone's tendency to experience high energy, positive feelings, like being enthusiastic, active, alert, like excited, energetic, and so on. However, again, quite consistently with what we talked about earlier, when this was controlled for, the creativity boost was still present. So in other words, they kind of reject the claim that the physical movement leads to better mood, which in turn leads to higher creativity. And instead we kind of shortcut that and say it's actually the physical movement that results in improved creativity, regardless of its effects on mood. So actually I just said that it results. Admittedly, I failed to note if they implied merely correlation or causation here, so interpret that with some caution, but that conclusion still stands, which is mood doesn't really matter. Physical movement that does seem to matter. So the effect was statistically significant, but kind of like a small to medium effect size. And that's for this study. Next one is titled Exercise Enhances Creativity Independently of Mood. And it's like the fifth time probably. 63 participants. You measured their mood. A whole bunch of questionnaires. The participants did aerobic exercise, like a workout or dancing, but nothing crazy, for 25 minutes prior to doing a creative task. What they found was a statistically significant but modest increase. Exercise also improved mood, but again, the creativity boost was independent of mood changes. And that's it for this study. Next one is titled Approaching Novel Thoughts. Understanding why elation and boredom promote associative thought more than distress and relaxation. So here they examined what they called affective state valence, orientation, and activation level. What this means is valence is whether you're feeling good, so this can be positive or negative. Orientation is whether your mood makes you want to like move towards something, so that will be called approach, or away from it, so avoidance. And the third one was activation level, which measured basically how much energy or mental alertness you have, ranging from high energy, so activated, to low energy, deactivated. The result is that out of these three, the orientation, so like whether you want to move towards something or away from it, that seems to be the most important aspect of this, meaning that approach-oriented states improved the creative performance on 2 tasks. Interestingly, an example of an approach-oriented state is boredom. I initially found this confusing, but if you think about it, like boredom is approach-oriented because boredom is usually a state where you do not want to remain in that state. You don't want to continue to be bored. You are in an approach-oriented state to seek stimulation to get out of that state. And so this is pretty crucial, because the study found that boredom is very distinct from just mere relaxation in terms of creative performance, because a relaxation is not quite the same approach-oriented state. Like subjectively, we all know the difference between sitting on a couch and being bored out of our minds, and like sitting in a spa after having a nice burger and just not thinking about anything, and having some of these whirlpools hit you from all sides, and it just kind of feels nice. So that's relaxation, and that's not quite as helpful, surprisingly, for helping with creativity as boredom. And the last thing it states, perhaps predictably, is that states with avoidance orientation, like distress, impair performance on creativity tasks. Next study, titled "How Does Emotion Influence the Creativity Evaluation of Exogenous Alternative Ideas?" This study had 55 participants from a university. The method here is that the participants viewed negative or positive or neutral images, or a negative or a positive or a neutral image for 6 seconds, then rated the creativity of an idea presented, not their own idea, but someone else's idea, they didn't know who, and they repeated this 252 times. And I should mention that it's not that one person was randomly shown either a positive or negative or a neutral image. It's like, there was one group that viewed positive images. So positive image, look at it for 6 seconds, rate an idea, then look at another positive image for 6 seconds, rate an idea, and so on 252 times, and then the same thing, but for different people who looked at like negative images. The ideas they were evaluating were alternate uses of everyday objects. So again, something we've already encountered here. If you're wondering how they defined what they meant by positive, negative, or neutral images, so positive, I found this strange, to be honest. For positive images, they chose like romantic couples. I don't know, man, I feel like it's a lot easier to choose a more representative positive image, but whatever. Maybe they probably know what they're doing better than me here. So positive images were romantic couples. Neutral images were images of like multiple people in an everyday context. I mean, that's probably the easiest to imagine for all of us. And on the negative images, they kind of went full send. This was mutilated bodies or violence. So it's just gore. They found a statistically significant result for the positive images, where in that group, people rated ideas as more creative overall compared to the groups that were looking at either neutral or negative images. There was another result, also statistically significant for the negative images, which is that it didn't make people rate ideas differently overall compared to the neutral condition. There was a bit of nuance though, which is that these ratings, these effects, were quite dependent on how creative the ideas were to begin with. So what this means is that in the group of people that viewed positive images, higher ratings, they gave higher ratings for non-creative and highly creative ideas. So they were more generous for both ends of the spectrum, but not really towards the middle. And for the group that looked at negative images, they gave lower ratings for moderately creative ideas. So you might be asking, okay, how does that square with what you just said? Because like a minute ago you said that the group that looked at the negative images didn't rate the ideas all that different, but that was overall. And the nuance is that, like, overall it wasn't really different, but the negative image group was harsher for kind of the middle of the spectrum, for ideas that were moderately creative. And the study design, as the last note here, the study design quite strongly implies causation, but I don't think there was a very clear proposed mechanism for how this works. So that's that study. Next one. It's titled "Exploring the Effect of Red and Blue on cognitive task performances. This study had 125 Chinese college students aged 18 to 25, 93 of which were females. They were randomly divided into 3 experimental groups. We'll get to that in a second. So, actually, no, I need to say this now. Sorry, I just got a brain freeze. So they were split into 3 different groups. One that was exposed to the color red, the other group the color blue, the third one to gray. The result was that exposure to blue enhanced performance on creative tasks. If you're wondering what exactly does exposure to the color blue mean, if I noted this down correctly, it was the background color on a screen during a task. Blue outperformed red and neutral gray backgrounds. Interestingly, the red color did not help or hurt creativity compared to gray. So red and gray were basically the same in that regard. This was measurably effective and statistically significant. Again, these were lab conditions, very specific kind of creativity tests. So not really a miracle, but it does sound like a very simple thing to try and cost effective. What I found interesting is that, like, based on the results here, you can't really make the claim that red tanks creativity, because it didn't do much compared to gray, and instead it's, it may be more likely simply that blue is the kind of color that enhances it compared to baseline. And the reason why, and I know I'm saying this point for the second time now, but the reason I'm reiterating that is because there's a lot of pseudoscience on color theory. Much of it is certainly about creativity, and it's like every color is assigned some special abilities. Like red is going to make you come up with the perfect wedding idea, and indigo will help you think of which mountain bike to buy. It's like, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it's just like blue, good, the other color a bit, or not very effective. Alright, so the next study we have is titled Creativity and Innovation Under Constraints, a cross-disciplinary integrative review. This is from 2018. It was a review of 145 studies. And what they found is basically this inverted U-curve relationship between constraints and creativity, meaning if you have too many constraints, it is stifling. If you have too few, it can easily lead to complacency, and you might go for ideas that are kind of the path of least resistance, where like most intuitive ideas that come to mind will take precedence compared to an approach where you invest in the development of better ones. What they suggest is that constraints can mitigate, how did I pronounce that? Constraints can mitigate the analysis paralysis, and that novelty-seeking people thrive under these conditions. Now, broadly speaking, they kind of looked at 3 categories of constraints. It's called input, process, and output constraints. So input constraints, I think this is the kind that come to most people's minds when they hear constraints, which is resource constraints. Also like resource scarcity, right? Maybe you limit yourself to some maximum budget that you can spend on developing some idea, for example. Process constraints, so that's the second category. So that might be imposing certain rules in a brainstorming session, or interestingly imposing even some political correctness norms. I don't know, it feels like the other approach of constraining some brainstorming session or similar is more, how would I call it, less flammable. Is that the phrase? I don't know, but I guess you know what I mean. The output constraints were product/design requirements or specifications. And specifically, like these are the constraints that can all be viewed in the context of that U curve, regardless of which category they fall under. If you know, like I mentioned, the categories that they examined, but it doesn't mean that you need to now impose either input or process or output constraints. But generally speaking, if you impose moderate constraints on any of the following sort of categories, then that may help. And these are time pressure / deadlines, financial or material resources. It can also be like formalization or setting some standard procedures, or constraining yourself to use some very specific innovation framework. Now, not all studies agree on this. Some found, surprisingly enough, that input constraints don't seem to be very impactful here. Now, like I mentioned before, the method here wasn't testing some participants. This was basically a review of earlier studies, and like is the case with all of these meta-analyses, you can never really guarantee that all of these kinds of studies will have the same way of measuring creativity. Like some viewed it in the light of R&D spending, others in like patent applications or new product introductions or number of ideas during a brainstorming session. Like those are very different, right? I mean, it's very different if you measure creativity by the number of patent applications versus the number of ideas you generate during a corporate brainstorming session. And this is the one thing I wanted to come back to, because if you remember, there was an earlier study that I talked about where this was the Mike Goodman stuff, procrastination and like incentivizing people to watch some SNL skits, and where the study claimed that a moderate procrastination on the start, progress, or completion of a task may be beneficial. They propose a certain mechanism there, but I think it was a pretty, at least to me, it feels like a pretty good example of essentially having a time constraint, right? Where, I mean, if you procrastinate, that doesn't magically expand the time limit that you're given for the task, and you still must complete it within that time limit, but now you're pressured by the fact that you have less time to do so. So I think that may have been an example of just moderate resource constraint. The last part about this review of constraints was that they found it to be least suitable for like radical innovation tasks or projects, and most suitable for incremental innovation. Next one, titled Perceived Social Support Increases Creativity, Experimental Evidence. The conclusion was that social support has a positive relationship with creativity. The sample was 135 undergrads in Malaysia. This was an online experiment where they had the experimental and control group. What they said is that the perceived, even just perceived, like it doesn't even have to be actual, but even just perceived social support leads to, they said leads, not necessarily correlates with, so they're suggesting this is causal, to higher creativity. A study in 2022, and this is, like, I'm not reading that as a separate different study, we're still sticking with this one, but it is related, but one other study in 2022 showed that perceived social support, even via like recalling supportive memories, like just a recall, yeah. I want to emphasize that because it sounds, well, doesn't matter, we're going to get to that in a second, but prosím? Yeah. Okay, that wasn't for me. He was talking with someone. So one study from 2022 found that even recalling memories of perceived social support led to a significant increase across multiple measures. So it was recall of actual social support, not of perceived support, because you can't really recall perceived social support because that doesn't make sense. So even recalling those memories led to an increase across multiple measures like divergent thinking and self-rated creativity, which again, not very interesting because people self-report all kinds of stuff, but like I said, it also actually improved on various other measures that were not self-reported. Social cohesion, which is how close we feel to others, like that's a bit of a different concept and isn't as clear as social support. Now, one counterpoint to this is that there was a study on musical improvisation, which you might be wondering how that relates to social support. Well, the context of that study is that increased social cohesion was associated with less creative musical outcomes, which intuitively I think makes sense because excessive social cohesion might prioritize group harmony over some novel exploration, especially in like collaborative contexts. Meaning if you're playing in a band of, I don't know, 5 people, like you probably don't want to be the one guy who just constantly is coming up with some crazy new ideas to do something, because, well, assuming that none of the other guys are on board. Right? If you all kind of have that dynamic, then sure, yeah, that can be nice, but you don't want to be the guy to kind of break that social cohesion because it's just not really worth it. So when it's excessive, especially in collaborative contexts, it might actually impair creativity. Next one is called Social Influences on Creativity, Evaluation, Coaction, and Surveillance. This is an old study from 1990, had 48 female participants that looked at the effects of evaluation, coaction, and surveillance. These were 2 experiments. They had 3 variables. So in the first experiments, half the subjects worked in small groups and the other half worked alone, but they were in the same physical space. So this is an example of what they call coaction. In the second experiment, half the subjects were led to believe that they are being watched while working. So this is an example of what they then labeled surveillance, perhaps understandably. The third variable was evaluation. So some subjects expected, or knew that their work would be evaluated by experts, others did not. for those whose output was evaluated, it was evaluated by experts. The findings was that the creativity of groups that were expecting evaluation by experts was lower. Co-action, so the presence of others, had no effect, and surveillance had a weak negative effect, and that's pretty much it. On stuff like gestures, we don't have a whole lot of data. I mean, there is like one study that looked at it, but the sample size, the demographics of the participants, like these were children, and the creativity tasks involved like physical objects. And I mean, the conclusion there, the TLDR of it, without going through all of it, is that gestures seem to be beneficial for creativity. But the mechanism they suggested is because like gestures, especially when, let's say, you're thinking of some alternate uses for an object, like that allows you to, you know, like rotate it, like look at it from different positions, maybe visualize it differently in your head, and so that may help on certain aspects. But generally speaking, we don't have a lot of data there. Music, this is quite complex and controversial. Mixed results. And there was a 2019 study on background music that looked at whether music with lyrics or just instrumental has any effect on creativity, regardless of whether you are familiar with the song or not. What they found is that it actually significantly impaired performance compared to quiet conditions, suggesting that music was simply a distraction. Then there was a 2023 study that suggesting music might benefit mood, which could indirectly support creativity. But then again, like there were like 5 studies that we went over throughout this video that showed mood doesn't really have to do a whole lot with creativity. Most studies in the context of music lean toward like neutral, so meaning no effect, or a negative impact. Some studies found that music with a negative emotional charge can boost creativity, but you have to interpret these results with caution, because everyone is kind of finding different things here. One interesting study was one that found that people's preference for diverse genres correlates with their creativity levels. So that kind of reinforces the idea that higher openness to experience and a variety of input and novelty can enhance creativity. But whether you can kind of force yourself into listening to different genres and increase your creativity, or if that's kind of just the downstream effect of having a certain kind of personality, that I don't know. When it comes to fasting / metabolic rate or handwriting or time of day or breathing methods, not a lot of data there. Conclusions, the do's and don'ts from this entire video. The do's, sort of in order of most to least important. Main thing, just diversifying, like seeking diversifying experiences, exposing yourself to novelty in whatever way you can. Next one is that's still within diversifying experiences. So novelty or deep engagement with other cultures, maybe going on an Erasmus tour or something if you're in school. Like seriously engaging in skills or hobbies that are completely outside of your domain, maybe unique sensory environments, and so on. Spending meaningful time in nature. And the core idea here is just like enriching the cognitive landscape with various inputs. this all seems especially helpful if you already possess good coping mechanisms. Next one, creativity training, like comprehensive longer-term programs in areas like design thinking, problem-solving frameworks, metacognitive skills, and so on. This needs more commitment than just like a single workshop. So as that, meditation protocols, so that integrative mind-body training, so restful awareness of bodily sensations, also probably needs more commitment. Remember that was 30 minutes a day for 7 days, and the type of meditation you choose may matter. So this is not the same as like simple relaxation. Strategic procrastination, but do so there's the next one, strategical procrastination, but do this only if you are intrinsically motivated. Don't beat yourself up over delay on starting or finishing a task. And there's a trade-off. I mean, here there's a trade-off with efficiency, of course. Next one, seeking approach-oriented states. It's probably not surprising, but like approach-oriented states such as like those where you feel curious and elated, excited, they help facilitate that kind of associative thinking that is a core part of creativity. The core idea here, at least I think, might be that boredom, like I mentioned earlier, boredom might be especially beneficial. I mean, the studies show that boredom is helpful, and the reason there is probably the fact that it is an approach-oriented state where you are approaching something that is not boredom. So that's not the same as soaking in a bathtub. So don't be afraid to, I don't know, sit on a couch and stare at a wall, and that may in fact give you better results than going into, I don't know, some sensory deprivation tank. Next one, moderate constraints. This is a U-shaped relationship, too few, complacency, too many, stifling. These can be constraints on time, resources, and so on. It helps you avoid being paralyzed by having a lot of options, especially useful for iterations or incremental innovation. Next one, social support. So feeling supported by others does show a causal link to increased creativity. This can be activated even by recalling supportive memories. The caveat here is that, like we mentioned, a very high social cohesion might actually stifle it, where you try to conform to some group you're a part of, as opposed to trying to actually be creative. Dim lighting is a bit of slightly experimental, but very dim, 25 to 150 lux. So that's that. Next one, physical disorder. Again, moderation. Somewhat messy environment, not like crazy, but somewhat messy environment may lead to more creative ideas, specifically in terms of novelty. Physical movement, habitual. You don't need to work out like Ronnie Coleman, but just like more habitual movement per day does correlate with better performance on creativity tests, and it seems independent of mood enhancement. Color, also slightly experimental, but the studies, or the one that we talked about, did show that the color blue was able to enhance performance compared to red and gray. The N1 stage of sleep, so just like thinking about a topic or a problem that you want to be more creative on before you go to sleep. Alcohol, _very moderate, can also be just bullshit because the demographics of that study was like 40 people that were males, social drinkers, 21 to 30 years of age, and 0.075 blood alcohol content level. Now, as for the don'ts, don't try to do creative tasks where you are expecting the evaluation or like judgment of or surveillance of others. Also might give some validity to the idea that if you're just starting something new, especially kind of the experimental / creative realm, maybe just, you know, don't tell people about it so soon. So that's that. Intense exercise doesn't really help. Acute strenuous exercise impaired both divergent and convergent thinking if the task was performed during or shortly after. Like if you're insanely physically active, it may be fine for you, but generally don't expect miracles from it. At best, if you are really highly trained, it may confer a slight benefit, but more likely than not, it's going to be neutral at best and negative at worst. Background music results are mixed and controversial, but just generally lean a lot more on the idea that, again, neutral at best and most likely just distracts you and impairs your creativity, regardless of whether the music has lyrics or not, or if you're familiar with it. So that's that. Cannabis. There was correlation between cannabis use and creativity, but this was mediated by personality traits, not by actual cannabis use. So do not smoke weed if you want to get more creative. Some universal kind of rules or guidelines is that there's a huge diversity in all ways of enhancing creativity. There's not really like a single optimal set of practices, including these ones, so be cautious. What is inconclusive is microdosing, I think. Lots of subjective reports, of course, but hard to do. Placebo control, and also not legal in a vast majority of places. And lastly, we have fasting / metabolic rate, or handwriting, or like time of day or breathing exercises. Not really a whole lot of data there. I mean, I know there's data on handwriting as it relates to memory, I think, like when you're learning something, but not in terms of creativity. And I think that's a wrap. I'm actually shocked that I managed to go through this without my battery running out. You may have noticed that I was talking a lot faster in the past half hour. Admittedly, I am extremely lost.